The years after the slave war constituted a new global era. Shaojin and its industrial might was the premier power of the age, attracting local Chinese immigrants and rewarding its allies with trade secrets, as well as access to its markets and resources, namely Gaizhou and the Heian shogunate of Japan. These three, as well as their Therma, were the only four states to weather the economic backslide which devastated the world afterwards. International trade nearly collapsed overnight, as the entire system of prices and trades had to be recalculated to figure in the cost of labor. This resulted in mere depressions for states like Rome or Serdia, but brought wholesale destruction to import-dependent nations like Iskland and Toro, which suffered mass famines as a result. The defeated nations in Asia, meanwhile, through their blood and squalor, forged an alliance between themselves on August 17, 1877, a coalition against Shaojin and its domineering industrial might, called the Soshi League, meaning Four Lions. The four lions in question were Poyang, Namning, Laizhou, and Urad. Their policy was one of mutual aid and containment, linking their economies with the goal of recovery and with a mind to shut out Shaojin from local and international markets. Their unstated goal, of course, was one of resurgence, seeking a return to the world order in which Shaojin was a middling empire, locked in by the more nautical powers. Of course, this didn't stop organized crime from filling in the cracks left by what was once ironclad state power. Once, in the agrarian system of Poyang, there were bands of peasants who struck out on their own to serve local plantation owners, protecting them from bandits and ensuring their human capital did not escape, doing so for a nominal fee. These bands, colloquially known as the Yehu, or Night Tigers, became an ingrained part of Poyang society, especially in the countryside. As slavery was abolished and industrialization reached a fever pitch, a mass exodus of rural folk flooded into the cities, and with them, men who called themselves Yehu. In the cities, their bonds didn't simply dissolve. Instead, they began to provide new services. Instead of providing protection to large plantations, they provided protection to local businesses and landlords. Of course, there wasn't always a need for their services, so some of the more enterprising members made one. Protection against outside threats became a mandatory tax on local businesses under pain of death. And so the Yehu gang was born, beginning with protection rackets, but with their eyes set on much greater goals indeed. What proved a great comfort to all in Asia, meanwhile, was the colonization of Europe. These holdings, called Saichan, meaning possessions, once served as bases from which to strike out against nearby enemies, but now served another purpose. After the war, these were integrated as direct territorial patrimonies of the Chinese colonizers, who all pursued their own unique colonial policies. For example, Shaojin was a domineering colonial master, installing a colonial governor, extracting resources, and building factories which processed materials or goods for the home country. Their Hibernian Saichan was a particularly egregious example. They passed laws which limited so-called excess agricultural work, redirecting workers towards factory labor, namely in the production of iron and processing of coal. This led to a famine in 1878, which led to the deaths of over 1 million people between 1878 and 1881. When Shaojin's colonial governor softened agricultural restrictions. Meanwhile, in the lowlands, they established a massive system of correctional religious schools under the direct control and supervision of the Yuzhou Church, called Rongyu, or honor schools. These are where children of local authorities across the country had to participate as boarding students from the ages of 10 to 15, a package which included conversion and education in the Chinese tongue. These facilities were well known for their austerity, making lavish use of corporal punishment and even isolation. Shaojin, which styled itself as a grand liberator of mankind, justified this behavior by stating that the locals were free and not bound to any master, and that the Rongyu schools were a service for which the locals should demonstrate immense gratitude to receive for free. They pretended that their slavery was anything but, because the people had the choice to die of starvation or overwork. It made it seem as though the slave war, which had claimed the lives of so many for a supposedly righteous cause, was nothing more than smoke and mirrors, a pretense for a power play. Poyang's colonial policy was ironically much more relaxed, with their Biscay colony between Avarignia and Tribalia becoming the model for the rest of the empire. Instead of installing a colonial governor, they installed a colonial magistrate, who served as an advisor and confidant to a local rex, a monarch hand-picked from among the local aspirants to power. In this case, the rex of the Biscay Saichan was a man from Tribalia named Francois Avaland, and it was broadly up to him and his cabinet of ministers how to administer the colony. Poyang, meanwhile, invested in the region, its development and its education, funding these local initiatives and reaping the rewards in the form of a healthy tax. Unlike Shaojin's colonies, the colonies of Poyang were not settled by thousands of people seeking fortune. Instead, nearly all of Poyang's colonists in the Biscay Saichan were found at their military college in Navarra. Poyang's colonial philosophy became one of raising up the locals and enjoying the fruits of their labor as they did so. As such, many converted to Christianity of their own volition, and even attended some of the non-mandatory universities they set up along the coast. Finally, Nam Ning lorded over Corsica with a firm but inattentive hand. They essentially assumed control over all the local operations, but were very hands-off. Outside of their sprawling country estates, it was almost as though they weren't there at all. They collected the same taxes the Romans did, administered the same projects the Romans did, and never even bothered setting up any schools for the locals. Meanwhile, Zarathurma, alone in all the world, watched for an opportunity to employ its new wealth in a gainful fashion, which they almost immediately found in the Pacha War of 1879. The Pacha Federation rejected Shaojin's attempts to turn them into a subject, and then further rejected their advances for conversion. When Shaojin forged ahead anyway, their missionaries were brutally murdered, breaking the alliance between them and resulting in a large-scale invasion of the Pacha Federation. The Huron and their network of native allies, traditionally rivals of the Pacha, lent their aid and support, eventually drawing in the remainder of the native presence. Pomo attempted to back them up with material support, but were curtailed in their efforts by Lacandon. Smelling the blood in the water, Zarathurma committed a flood of gold towards the effort of beating Shaojin to the Ohio River, declaring war upon the Pacha Federation and all the native tribes besides. By 1882, the Pacha Federation collapsed, its constituent tribes abandoning it almost immediately. As a result, Zarathurma got its pound of flesh and more soil in which to grow its hot weather cash crops like sugar and cotton. Shaojin wasn't satisfied, however, and would pursue its trail of blood all the way to the far north, subjugating the remaining native elements by 1888. This also prompted Avarignia's colony of Pumiapis to swell in size, annexing the surrounding tribes of Pengbay's far northeast, and even resulted in Iskland's annexation of Greenland in 1890. The Pacha War claimed over 2 million lives, most of them native. Shaojin would then forcefully resettle the remaining natives along the now tense border of Avarignia in a long, thin reservation, which would come to be plagued by disease and destitution. With this, the conquest of the New World would finally be completed. However, Zarathurma got out of the war in 1882, so had time to redirect its efforts and energies towards a far grander project, carving a great canal through the thinnest part of the Panama Isthmus. This would not only force the world to interact and trade with Zarathurma, which could even charge for use of its revolutionary canal. However, early efforts proved frustrating, with several thousand laborers dying of disease and hundreds more lost to mudslides. It became clear that such a project would not be completed before the dawn of the 20th century, and so Zarathurma chipped away, waiting for a breakthrough of any real significance. Indeed, it became a national obsession, and much of the treasury went towards it. It soon became the main source of employment for the entire republic, and even gained its own guild, and thus a say in politics, assigning yet more funds to itself. Speaking of canals, in 1885, a revolutionary deal was struck between Rajasthan and Phrygia, the construction of the Suez Canal. Rajasthan had the funds and Phrygia the industrial might, leading to the carving of the most important trade artery yet made by man. It allowed the Chinese powers to access their European colonies in a way they were not able to before, resulting in rapid investment, as well as the enrichment of Phrygia and Rajasthan, the joint owners of the canal, who used it as a way to counter Mongol power. This move further impoverished Africa, leading to riots in Avarignia's South African colony, and Toro's final obliteration at the hands of the Chinese, dividing it amongst themselves. Of course, this only whet their collective appetite for colonization, and hungry eyes would soon turn towards the continent's undefended interior. In 1894, the Yehu had long since spread to all the industrialized Chinese powers, and even immigrated to the Sichuan of Europe, where they found great success in rallying locals in Hibernia and the lowlands against their colonial governments, committing crimes as vast and varied as gambling rings to political assassinations. Indeed, they breathed new life into the Modigbanan and furnished them with better weapons and training, turning them from a local resistance force into a tried-and-true terrorist cell. They even did smuggling business with Zaratherma. Things then continued as they had straight past 1896, an age characterized by entrenched Chinese colonial power. Indeed, to the common man it may have seemed that their era of dominance would last forever. But, with the 20th century around the corner, preconceptions such as these would start to be challenged in force for the first time in centuries.